A few weeks ago, something seemingly minor unfolded in Ghana. There were no drums, no parades, and no grand declarations. Just 14 armored vehicles, sleek, powerful, and heavy, delivered quietly by the United States as a gift. Officials called it a gesture of goodwill, a reaffirmation of strong ties between Washington and Accra. The media barely noticed. No alarms were raised, until President John Mahama spoke. The president of Ghana, typically reserved on diplomatic matters, broke his silence with a statement that shook the continent. There was no gratitude, no pleasantries. Instead, it was a direct blow to the West. Mahama did not merely accuse the United States of interfering in African affairs, an old, familiar complaint. He went further. He accused America, and specifically former President Donald Trump, of trying to rewrite African history. This wasn't just a response. It was a declaration of war against silence, distortion, and erasure. With words as sharp as a scalpel, Mahama named what so many African leaders have avoided: media manipulation, historical amnesia, internal betrayal, and loyalty to colonial interests. In a world that forgets too easily, he chose to remember every wound, every truth, every broken promise. In this video, we dive into the heart of the storm. Why did a military gift trigger a diplomatic firestorm? Why did Mahama choose this moment to speak out? And what is really unfolding behind the scenes in the political struggle between Africa and the West? This is not just Ghana's story. It is a wake-up call for an entire continent. The White House air was unnaturally still. Cameras clicked, smiles were exchanged. But beneath the polished surface, something was boiling. President Cyril Ramaphosa sat across from Donald Trump in the Oval Office, hands folded, posture composed. Trump leaned back, eyes cold, like a man setting a trap. "I've seen the footage," Trump said flatly. "White farmers, killed, burned out. It's a genocide. Your country is spiraling." Ramaphosa blinked. "With respect, Mr. President, South Africa," Trump raised a hand. "Save the speech. I brought proof." He nodded. A staffer rolled a monitor into the room. The screen lit up with a video, Julius Malema, fierce and unrelenting, chanting, "Kill the Boer." The volume echoed unnaturally in the room. "This," Trump said, "is not democracy, it's chaos, and the world's watching." Ramaphosa swallowed hard. Every word now was a minefield. His aides remained silent. The meeting ended with awkward handshakes and hollow press lines. But halfway across the Atlantic, someone was watching, closely. In Accra, Ghana, President John Mahama stood before a television screen, arms crossed, jaw clenched. His aide, Kwame, whispered, "Should we prepare a diplomatic response?" Mahama shook his head. "No, not a response. A reckoning." Within hours, a statement was drafted, not buried in bureaucracy, but blazing with fury. Mahama didn't mince words. These are not just inaccuracies. These are strategic distortions designed to erase history and recast the victims as villains. He paused mid-sentence, then added a line that made his advisors shift uncomfortably. "And if Africa does not speak now, we surrender our right to remember." The Guardian published the full statement the next morning. The headline roared, "Ghana's President condemns Trump's white genocide claims as historical sabotage." It wasn't just a critique, it was a rupture. CNN picked it up. Al Jazeera ran the story. In Johannesburg, whispers grew louder. In Nairobi, students held impromptu lectures on colonial distortion. On Twitter, the hashtag #Chashaish Africa Remembers trended for the first time. Back in the White House, an aide handed Trump a printed copy of Mahama's remarks. He read silently, jaw tightening. "He's not playing the game," Trump muttered. "He's not in it," the aide replied. "He's rewriting the rules." Meanwhile, in Ghana, Mahama turned off his phone. No press, no interviews, just silence. He stared out the window of Jubilee House and whispered to no one in particular, "The battle isn't over land, it's over memory." And in that moment, across an entire continent, something shifted. The room was silent except for the rustling of paper and the low hum of the ceiling fan. President John Mahama sat alone in his study, dimly lit, surrounded by printed pages of his own statement, the one that had sparked a fire across the continent. He reread the last paragraph, slowly, deliberately. To forget is not peace, it is erasure. He whispered the line aloud, almost testing its weight. It felt heavier now, as if the words carried not just truth, but consequence. A knock at the door broke his trance. "Sir," said Kwame, his aide, "the students are waiting downstairs." Mahama nodded, stood, and folded the statement into his coat. He descended the stairs not as a president, but as a man burdened with memory. They had gathered in a circle 8 young Pan-African scholars, activists, writers. Their eyes burned with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. A woman in a brown head wrap stood first. "We read your piece, Mr. President. It's powerful." "But is it enough?" Mahama looked at her. She reminded him of someone. "It's a start," he said. The youngest of them, a man barely 25, stood next. "Sir, with respect, words haven't saved us before. Not from colonizers. Not from apartheid. Not from the coups." "Why now?" Mahama's voice dropped. "Because the war is no longer fought with bullets. It's fought with memory. And right now they are winning." There was silence, then murmurs. The kind of silence that comes before storms. Later that night, as the city lights of Accra flickered, Mahama's secure line rang. The voice on the other end was familiar. "Mr. President," said Luthando, a South African activist. Her tone hushed. "They're preparing something." "Who?" he asked. "The networks, Western ones. They're planning a series on white displacement in South Africa. They'll make Trump's lie look like a fact." Mahama exhaled. "A counter-narrative." "Yes," she replied. "And if we don't act now, your statement will be buried under sensationalism. Then we won't wait." He spent the next 2 days in isolation, researching, remembering. He pulled out old notes, his grandfather's letters, history books with torn covers. One quote struck him hard. From a colonial governor in 1914, "To civilize the African, you must first sever him from his memory." Mahama read it 3 times. Then he stood, walked to the whiteboard, and wrote a single phrase: "Memory is sovereignty." 3 days later, a private summit was called. No press, no aides, just leaders. Mahama stepped up to the podium, gaze steady. "Colleagues," he began, "I am not here to speak about Ghana. I am here to speak about Africa's future and the war already upon us." He laid it out, the distortion of South Africa's reality, the silence around apartheid's lasting legacy, the global campaign to twist African identity. What they could not steal with chains, he said, they now seek to erase with stories. He paused. "In the name of goodwill, they give us tanks, but in silence they strip our children of their past." The room was tense. Some leaned in, others frowned. A Nigerian official stood. "Are you suggesting we cut ties with the West?" "No," Mahama said calmly. "I am suggesting we remember who we are before they remind us who we were." Burkina Faso's leader stood, hands clapping. Finally he said, a voice that does not tremble. When Mahama exited the summit, reporters swarmed. "President Mahama, a word. Do you plan a Pan-African alliance?" "Is this a break from U.S. relations?" He said nothing. Only as he reached his car did he turn and speak. "If they erase our past," he said quietly, "we'll lose our future." Then he vanished into the night. The envelope was unmarked. At 1:37 a.m., a courier handed it to the guards outside Jubilee House. By 1:45, it was in President Mahama's hands. He opened it in silence, eyes darting across the classified intelligence. There were no foreign flags, no CIA, no MI6. This wasn't the West. It was ECOWAS. The report detailed a covert planned military coordination underway. Not against an invading force, not against foreign aggression, but against Niger. African soldiers preparing to confront another African nation. Ivory Coast was allegedly leading logistics, backed by France. Mahama dropped the file onto his desk, heart pounding. Get Kwabena, he said to the intercom. Now. National Security Advisor, Kwabena Owusu, arrived 20 minutes later, hair uncombed, eyes alert. They're really going through with it, Mahama asked. Kwabena nodded grimly. Ivory Coast is coordinating troops under the ECOWAS banner, but the orders aren't coming from Abuja. They're whispered from Paris. Mahama closed his eyes. So we're now attacking our own to honor a flag that no longer flies here. Kwabena hesitated. Sir, there's pressure on Ghana to stay neutral, but neutrality is a decision too. The images haunted him that night. Not from the report, but from memory. Mahama was a young minister in 2007, seated quietly in the corner of a closed African Union meeting in Addis Ababa. He remembered the air warm, filled with the scent of old cigars and rehearsed speeches. We must stand together, one leader had proclaimed. Pan-Africanism is our shield. But later in the hallway, Mahama overheard whispers in French, a president complaining that Chinese loans were too unpredictable. We need the Europeans, the man had said. They built us. They'll stabilize us. That night, Mahama walked the halls alone, realizing unity was just a slogan, convenient for speeches, inconvenient for action. The encrypted call connected at 4:02 a.m., Ibrahim, Mahama said softly. President Traoré's voice crackled on the other end. I know why you're calling. I had to hear it from you, Mahama said. Tell me it's not true. Tell me we're not about to repeat history. Traoré sighed. France never left. They just changed uniforms. Silence. Then Traoré added, we're standing, but we're alone. ECOWAS calls us rebels. Ivory Coast calls us traitors. And you, what will Ghana call us? Mahama didn't answer right away. I don't know, he finally said, but I won't call you the enemy. At sunrise, Mahama sat by the window, the city still cloaked in quiet. He watched a mother walk her son to school, and he thought, how did we get here? How did independence turn into compliance? Why are we using our armies not to defend, but to discipline each other on orders whispered from Paris or Washington? A message buzzed on his tablet. French documents leaked. They confirmed what everyone feared: coordination funding timelines. African troops. French logistics. Code-named Stabilité. The final page had one line in bold: Ghana expected to remain passive. He placed the folder in the center of his desk. The cabinet meeting would begin in 14 minutes. His advisors were expecting silence, diplomacy, delay. But Mahama had already made his decision. He walked down the hallway, footsteps echoing through the marble corridors of Jubilee House. He would not stay neutral, not now, not ever. The cabinet room was heavy with silence. Mahama stood at the head of the table, arms crossed. Ministers sat rigid, eyes darting from their notes to his face. The early light filtered in through narrow windows, but the atmosphere remained dark. We will not support the ECOWAS military operation against Niger, he said calmly. The silence broke like glass. You're what the finance minister snapped. Mr. President, with all due respect, this will cost us. Trade, aid, regional standing, the foreign affairs minister added, voice tight. We'll be isolated, another said. Nigeria will blacklist us. France, Mahama raised a hand. I understand the risks. Do you, the defense minister asked, rising. Because what you're suggesting, pulling back now, it makes us look weak. Disloyal. Even rebellious. Mahama turned to him. We cannot call ourselves free while acting as instruments of colonial legacy. And I will not lead Ghana into a war against a fellow African nation, because Paris said, jump. There was more shouting, heated debates, but Mahama's stance didn't change. When the room emptied, he sat alone, staring at a photo hanging above the fireplace, Kwame Nkrumah, first president of Ghana, fist raised on Independence Day, 1957. Mahama whispered to himself, our independence is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa. He had memorized that line as a boy. Today it felt more urgent than ever. Hours later his phone rang. Unknown number. The voice on the line was polite, measured, European accent. "President Mahama, this is Ambassador Delvaux. I believe we must speak candidly." Mahama said nothing. "The situation in Niger, while regrettable, has implications far beyond your borders. France is invested in stability." "Stability," Mahama echoed, "or control a pause. We have supported Ghana for decades. Investments, aid packages, defense packs. It would be unfortunate if that support shifted." "You mean withdrawn?" "Mr. President, we both understand how delicate the balance is. Isolation can be expensive." Mahama smiled coldly. "We've paid for silence long enough." He ended the call. That evening, he sat at his desk and opened a blank document. "To ECOWAS Executive Secretariat, subject position of the Republic of Ghana." He wrote in a single unbroken flow, no edits, no advisors. "The Ghanaian Republic was born from a promise that our freedom would be the beginning, not the exception. Today that promise is in peril. We cannot and will not support military action against a sovereign African state acting in pursuit of self-determination. To do so is to betray the memory of our liberation and the future of our continent. Ghana withdraws all cooperation from ECOWAS defense missions, effective immediately until further review." He hit send and waited for the storm. It came faster than expected. Reuters: Ghana pulls out of ECOWAS military bloc amid Niger crisis. Le Monde is Ghana, sabotaging West Africa's stability. Al Jazeera: Mahama's stand hero or pariah protests broke out in Lagos. Ambassadors were summoned. A French economic advisor threatened suspension of talks. But in Accra, a different mood was brewing. Students rallied. Civil groups issued support letters. Online, the hashtag, or Stand with Mahama, spread like wildfire. 3 nights later, Mahama stepped in front of a national camera crew. No teleprompter, no script. He stood before the Ghanaian flag. "My fellow citizens," he began today, "I address not only you, but every African who has ever wondered whether our freedom was real." He told the story of how the continent was once carved like meat at a colonial table, of how soldiers now marched not for sovereignty, but for someone else's profit. "This is not about war," he said. "It is about memory." He leaned forward. "We will not fight our brothers to please our former masters." Title: Memory Fire and the Future. The streets of Accra were calm, but the world was not. Mahama walked alone, his bodyguard trailing discreetly behind. The cool air of early dawn wrapped around him, but his mind burned. He had just addressed a continent. His words now echoed in parliaments, in cafes, in online spaces he'd never touch. He had lit a fire, but could he keep it alive? In Ouagadougou, young men marched with portraits of Mahama and Traoré held high. "Pan-Africanism is not dead," they chanted. In Lagos, talk shows debated the fallout. Economists warned of Ghana's isolation. Politicians hesitated, but not a single ECOWAS leader had issued a public statement. The silence was deafening. In private, however, their embassies buzzed with concern. 3 days later, Mahama visited a public school in the Volta region. The classroom walls were bright, the children's voices louder. But something made him pause. A boy stood to recite a colonial-era poem in French. Mahama watched quietly. The teacher smiled proud. "Why French?" Mahama asked gently afterward. "It's required by the national curriculum, sir," she said. "And the international exams?" "Well, they're in French and English." He nodded. But inside something cracked. We had broken the chains, he thought, but not the language. That night he gathered a dozen young minds, historians, educators, coders, archivists. "I need your help," he said. "We're losing our story." They listened as he outlined the idea, a national memory initiative. Not just a curriculum reform, a digital rebellion. Digitize lost archives, record oral histories, translate ancient texts, build a platform where every Ghanaian child could learn their history in their language. And not just Ghana, Mahama added. Africa must speak its own name again. The group sat in silence. Then slowly, one by one, they nodded. In the Garden of Jubilee House, Kwame sat across from him, sipping tea. "You've started something you may not be able to finish," he said. "I know. They'll come harder now. Not with tanks, but with trade deals, media pressure, economic threats." Mahama looked into the distance. "We always knew independence was incomplete." He turned to Kwame. "What good is political freedom if we teach our children with colonial tongues? If our heroes are footnotes and our oppressors are statues?" Kwame didn't answer. He didn't need to. At the African Union Summit 2 weeks later, Ghana presented a radical proposal, the Cultural Sovereignty Charter. One unifying African language to be adopted continent-wide. A continent-wide curriculum rooted in real African history. The restitution of artifacts and archives from European museums. Some gasped, others clapped, a few stormed out. But the vote was set. Mahama returned home. His advisors asked if he'd make another speech. "No," he said, something quieter. He sat alone in his study and began to write. "To the unborn child of Africa. I do not know your name, your tribe, your country. I only know you will be born onto a continent that has bled and risen more times than the world will ever teach you. I write not to warn you, but to prepare you. You will inherit 2 things, land and memory. One they may try to steal. The other they will try to erase. Guard both. Speak the names they told you to forget. Learn the languages they told you were inferior. And when they offer you silence in exchange for comfort, choose memory instead. This fire will be yours one day. May you never inherit silence." In a quiet corner of Ghana's political theater, a spark was lit, not through tanks or treaties, but through words. President John Mahama's uncompromising statement against American interference did not simply challenge a former U.S. president. It summoned an entire continent to wakefulness. There were no sirens, no military marches. Yet what unfolded was a declaration more explosive than any weapon, the refusal to forget. In that moment, Africa was reminded that memory is not nostalgia, it is resistance, and it is political. One of the most profound lessons emerging from this episode is that memory is a form of sovereignty. Mahama did not resist tanks or invasions. He resisted narratives. He opposed the quiet rewriting of African history in Western studios' newsrooms and diplomatic circles. His declaration, "Memory is sovereignty," was not just poetic, it was strategic. By reclaiming Africa's right to remember, Mahama highlighted that control over history is as vital as control over borders. For centuries, the African story has been told by others in languages not its own, shaped for audiences far away. The consequences have been far-reaching internalized inferiority, fragmented identity, and the dangerous belief that colonization was civilization. Mahama's intervention was a rupture in that cycle. He reminded Africa that forgetting is not healing, it is erasure. When historical lies are left unchallenged, they metastasize into policy prejudice and passivity. His words were not simply aimed at Donald Trump. They were aimed at every institution, Western or African, that allows historical distortion to stand unopposed. The second lesson is that modern warfare has shifted from the battlefield to the realm of perception. Mahama stated this plainly. The war is no longer fought with bullets, it's fought with memory. In this age, controlling the narrative means controlling the public mind. The image of Julius Malema chanting "Kill the Boer" was not just a political tool, it was a weapon of distortion. It was extracted from its context and repackaged to suggest that South Africa was descending into racial violence against whites, thereby justifying Western anxiety and potential interference. Mahama's fury was directed not merely at the lie, but at its strategic timing and calculated deployment. He understood that history, when misused, becomes a weapon of domination. The danger does not lie in loud invasions, but in quiet reframings. The battle for Africa's dignity is not waged in trenches, but in textbooks, news headlines, international forums, and even in silence. In such a war, Africa's best defense is its collective memory and its willingness to speak. The third and perhaps most sobering lesson is that colonialism never truly left it, only changed costume. The ECOWAS plot to mobilize African troops against Niger under the guise of regional stability was a chilling revelation. The logistics were Ivorian, the orders were whispered from Paris, and once again African soldiers were being rallied not against invaders, but against fellow Africans. This is not new. It is a repetition of old scripts, written in foreign capitals, acted out on African soil, and paid for with African lives. Mahama's decision to reject participation in this military operation was more than diplomatic defiance. It was moral clarity. He refused to let Ghana become a pawn in a chessboard crafted in Europe. He saw through the illusion of neutrality and named it for what it was: complicity. Neutrality is a decision too, he said, and it echoed far beyond Jubilee House. It was a challenge to every African leader who masked silence as diplomacy and compliance as pragmatism. Beyond the geopolitical, the story also highlights a critical domestic front. Education and cultural memory are the new battlegrounds. When Mahama watched a Ghanaian child recite a French colonial poem with pride, he did not scold the child, he mourned the system. He realized that the chains had been broken, but the curriculum had not. Colonialism had been expelled from the palaces, but remained in the classrooms. This insight gave birth to something revolutionary, a national memory initiative. It was not just policy, it was rebellion. Digitize forgotten archives, record elders' oral histories, translate indigenous texts, reclaim the stories buried in foreign museums, and most importantly, teach them in African languages. In that vision, Mahama declared that cultural sovereignty is inseparable from political sovereignty. A nation cannot call itself free if its children learn their identity in the tongue of their colonizer. Furthermore, the story reveals that true leadership is not measured by volume, but by conviction. Mahama did not seek the spotlight. He wrote letters when others gave speeches. He invoked ancestors when others quoted analysts. And he made decisions knowing full well that they could cost Ghana economic support, diplomatic favor, or international approval. But leadership, as he modeled it, is not about comfort. It is about conscience. When he addressed the continent on national television, he did not present himself as a messiah. He offered no easy solutions. But he said the words that many feared to say: "We will not fight our brothers to please our former masters." With that, he repositioned Ghana, not just geopolitically, but morally. The final and perhaps most intimate lesson is about the duty of memory to future generations. The letter Mahama wrote to the unborn child of Africa was more than poetic, it was prophetic. In it, he reframed history as inheritance, not just the land beneath our feet, but the names, languages, and stories buried beneath our silence. He warned that both would be under attack and that both must be defended. We will inherit two things, land and memory. One they may try to steal, the other they will try to erase, he wrote. This lesson is urgent for educators, leaders, parents, and storytellers across Africa. Without memory, there is no identity. Without identity, there is no unity. And without unity, there can be no liberation. In conclusion, the story of Mahama is not just a tale of a president who resisted Western pressure. It is the portrait of a man who understood that freedom is not only about resisting occupation, but also about resisting erasure. The true post-colonial challenge for Africa is not to reject tanks, but to rebuild its own narrative, to reclaim what was hidden, to teach what was untaught, and to choose memory, not silence. As the continent grapples with new alliances, new pressures, and new distractions, it must remember the most powerful revolution is not always loud. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, "We remember," Across the African continent, President John Mahama's bold declaration reverberated far beyond Ghana's borders. Citizens, intellectuals, educators, and young people alike found in his words not just a political statement, but a long overdue moral reckoning. For many, his refusal to support military action against Niger, his condemnation of Western manipulation, and his insistence on preserving Africa's historical memory marked a turning point in how Africans see themselves and their leaders. In Dakar, students from the University of Cheikh Anta Diop gathered in small groups to reflect on his statement. They expressed admiration for Mahama's courage, noting that his speech was not only directed at Donald Trump or Western narratives, but at a larger system that has systematically erased African stories. One student commented that Mahama had spoken what many African leaders had long feared to say, that forgetting is not a neutral act, but a dangerous form of surrender. In Soweto, faith leaders and elders invoked Mahama's words during Sunday sermons. Pastors highlighted his sentence, "We will not fight our brothers to please our former masters," as a sacred call for unity and dignity. To them it was a rare moment when politics and conscience aligned. Rather than viewing his stance as radical, they saw it as redemptive. Educators across the continent responded with deep emotion. In rural Kenya, a history teacher wrote publicly that he had been ashamed for years to teach colonial history from British textbooks. Mahama's message gave him the courage to advocate for new curricula grounded in African truth, not colonial apology. Teachers in South Africa, Ghana, and Nigeria echoed this sentiment, calling for educational reforms that prioritize indigenous narratives and languages. Media professionals, particularly in French-speaking countries, were struck by the implications of Mahama's challenge to ECOWAS and France. Ivorian journalists noted that his refusal to align with a French-backed military campaign exposed the persistent colonial undertones of regional politics. In Bamako, retired military officers applauded his choice, acknowledging that African armies have too often served foreign interests rather than continental sovereignty. Young people in cities like Lagos, Nairobi, and Accra viewed Mahama's decision as a generational wake-up call. For many of them, Pan-Africanism had become a vague slogan, often repeated but rarely practiced. Mahama's words gave it substance. They began to share his speech online, organize forums, and demand that their own leaders take positions with similar clarity. Hashtags such as Africa Remembers and Stand with Mahama became digital symbols of a growing consciousness. Even in classrooms and homes, Mahama's influence was felt. Parents shared his message with their children. Professors assigned his speech as reading material. A university freshman in Nairobi confessed that inspired by Mahama, he now aspired to become a historian, not to memorize colonial dates, but to protect and preserve what others tried to erase. In Lomé, an elderly woman told her granddaughter that Mahama had fulfilled what Kwame Nkrumah once envisioned, but never saw, realized a leadership grounded in memory, not in Western validation. That sentiment echoed through radio shows, in Kinshasa community gatherings in Kigali, and intellectual salons in Addis Ababa. Economists and policy analysts, while acknowledging the financial risks Ghana might face, insisted that Mahama's moral stance had greater long-term value. They argued that Africa's true strength will not be measured by GDP or donor aid, but by its ability to stand with dignity, even when it stands alone. In the cultural sphere, artists, poets, and filmmakers began composing tributes to the moment. Some compared Mahama to anti-colonial figures of the past, while others saw him as the voice of a new generation of post-colonial leaders who understand that the battle is no longer over borders, but over narratives, language, and memory. What united all these voices was a shared realization Mahama's speech had broken the silence. It had revealed that neutrality is not always peace, that diplomacy must not come at the cost of truth, and that history belongs to those who defend it. His message transcended Ghana. transcended party politics and touched something deeper, the collective African soul. Across the continent, people did not all agree on the consequences, nor did they all have the same political stance. But a quiet consensus began to form. Muhammad had said what needed to be said. And in doing so, he had given the people of Africa something that had long been missing, not just hope, but a reason to remember and a reason to speak.